Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today is October 19th, 2025, and we have a fascinating conversation in store for you on the concept of singularity. Joining us today is our distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and our Director of Community and Citizen Science and 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential Candidate, Daniel Tweed. And our special guest today joining us for the second time for a virtual Enlightenment Salon, though I have spoken with him on numerous other occasions, is Andreas Xirtus. He is a popular podcaster with a large following. He is the founder of a historical restoration society known as Tartary Nova and director of the Fediverse, a free software foundation creating tools to protect free speech. And actually, my last conversation with him was on the importance of freedom of speech, especially in this turbulent time that we live in. He has studied nanotechnology and worked as a nanotechnology engineer and microsatellite specialist for NASA, a social media strategist for Turner Entertainment, and a content creator at Timcast Media. And I will note, we also had a great discussion with him at our virtual Enlightenment Salon of December 3rd, 2023 on the current media and social media landscape. If you didn't watch that, please go and watch it after this salon. And you can also visit his website at andreas.me and also see his resume, which is quite formidable. So, Andreas, welcome. We're pleased to have you again. And tell us your thoughts on the idea of singularity. This is a concept that has many different meanings, and as our friend Mike Lazine has already noted in the chat, each person in our community of transhumanists and allies would have different views on the singularity. So I would be curious as to what your views are.
Yeah, thank you, and also thank you for presenting my history as accolades instead of accusations. I'm pretty sure that the same things I've done impress some people and worry others, but I am just a human being still. I'm not quite a digital immortal yet. I think that that's part of the goal for a lot of us, is to figure out ways of extending life, or not just the quantity of life, but the conditions of life. And I think the singularity is a big buzzword for a lot of people because of that, because when you reach a point where you can accomplish any of your goals and dreams, then you can probably live forever if that's something you want to do. And so that's something that I think shared a lot of interest to transhumanists. But it's not only a transhumanist idea, it might just be a technological observation that things are telescopically becoming quicker. Anything that you want to do might have taken 1,000 years, then 100 years, then a decade, and now a year. And pretty soon you'll see this instantaneously. I think that's the biggest thing about the singularity, is it's the quickest point to any other point. So when I think of any sort of idea that I would want to achieve, I can 3D print it faster than I can have it delivered to me, right? That's maybe the hope, or portal technology. But there's even more to it. It's with AI. If I have an idea that I don't know how to execute, that AI can very quickly figure out how to almost instantaneously execute this idea. What if I want this? The genie in the bottle makes that happen, right? And I think there's also the Moore's law aspect of it, where things are getting smaller and smaller and closer together, so that there's basically no space between any sort of light, if there's photonics we're talking about, that can share in data strands at the same time. So singularity can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but I use it basically for this idea that it's when you can make any moment after this one what you want it to be. I really think it's as ambiguous in general as that. If I want the next timeline not to be based on the consequentialism of the past, but we can use femto printers to rearrange molecules to be the way that they were in the Napoleonic Waterloo battle for some reason, that's something that in the singularity would be possible. So the singularity is not only the ability to achieve any goal that you have, but also the ability to travel to or to create any world any way you want it to. And we will no longer be held by the conditions of we have to build this and work super hard in order to get to this point that's taken thousands of generations of working together in order to get to. We could literally just rearrange everything instantaneously. And that's a big change from not just consequentialism or civilization, but also time space itself. I think Nima Akrani Hermed has talked about this a lot, that our ideas of space time are going to change as we approach the singularity, because we'll be able to rearrange things any way we want. And that, I think, is very imminent. And it might be something that, if you believe in multiverse theoretical quantum physics, that's already been achieved in a range of probabilistic causal timelines. If there are other timelines, then some of them have already achieved a point where they reach nonlinear time. And I think that's a big part of this kind of Kardashev scale reality. If you can arrange the way light is radiating and changing and absorbing and symmetrically connecting different realities, or I'm sorry, different atoms and different structures, then you're able to switch between one reality or another. And so it's not that you hit the end of time, it's that you get to outside of time, where you're no longer destined by what has come before you. I think that's like the biggest thing that makes the singularity seem kind of intense and fantastical and science fiction to a lot of people, is that it basically means the end of time as we know it. Because time has been this thing you're a slave to. It can't be forever if we're able to choose the way things will be laid out. And I think that's about imminent, probably in the next 10 years. I think we're almost to a point where technology is going to make it beyond nanoscale, but beyond microsizing and nanoscale. We're now reaching these femto scale technologies and understanding how things are arranged in nature. And if we can do this, then we can actually choose what the future will be, maybe even put ourselves back into a world where everything is arranged the way it was, the way we think it was arranged. With AI, we could probably understand the path back towards the Big Bang to earlier times in history and rearrange those as well. So this is something that has been talked about by a lot of other people. And there's all sorts of articles you can read from, the deep state, right? Like the government in the 70s had Ingo Swann doing research into Mars and all these kind of outlandish romantic ideas of, is there, life on other worlds, or are humans able to travel through time as it already happened? There are remote viewer declassified documents like the Stargate project that have talked about this already, and Mirror Project Looking Glass, this idea that maybe even through computers built in the late 80s, they're able to send data back to older computers that are already open in the 1960s. And all this stuff seems pretty science fiction at first, but when you start to look into it, there's a lot of evidence that we're already dealing with people traveling through time, maybe not even traveling through time, but communicating in different moments in time. And I see this more and more as something that's affecting us, because this idea that we're living in a simulation doesn't seem accurate to me exactly. I don't think we're too far off with using this term, using the ideas of simulation. But it might be that simulation is sort of a metaphor or a meta scheme to describe what's actually happening, which is we're getting to a point where we can actually construct and manipulate our own reality. Everything that reality is made of, all of the atomic mass, all of the energy, all of the flow from one symmetry to another based on those clock crystals that are stars and suns that are used to radiate us and create time, that we'll live in a future very soon that's outside of time. And it's interesting to describe that future as a place, a space-time place, rather than just a consequential event that will occur. That there really will be a outside of the present future that's able to manipulate the past.
This is quite fascinating. So thank you for outlining this vision. And it is an extremely open vision. I would say one of the most open and ambitious visions for the idea of a singularity that I have heard. And of course, there have been a lot of thinkers who have pondered this concept, and there's some resonance with ideas that have been articulated previously. So, John von Neumann, the famous mathematician, toward the end of his life, he unfortunately died in 1957, described the accelerating progress of technology and changes in human life, which gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the human race, beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue. So, the idea of the singularity as an event horizon, as a point beyond which we really cannot foresee from our present vantage point what will happen, was articulated by John von Neumann. And I have been thinking about this view of a singularity for quite some time, for more than a decade. And it occurred to me that we have actually had at least three such singularities already: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the information revolution, in the sense that those who lived before those revolutions really could not see, at least in full resolution or even close to it, what the world would be like in the aftermath of those revolutions. You also spoke about the idea to essentially wish something into existence and have it arrive without a whole lot of effort being expended to do that. And I see that happening in various areas of technology now with generative AI. Now, there are still some imperfections in the process, but it is feasible to an extent that has not occurred in prior eras, to just think of a concept, an idea for a work of art or a piece of music and have it appear. And now with videos as well, have it appear within minutes, if not seconds, of one having conceived of the prompt. So I'm curious, in your view, what do you think will be the technological path toward the kind of singularity that you describe? What tools are going to be a part of it? And is the current generation of AI models part of that path? Or is it just an interesting technology that gives us some capabilities, but maybe we'll need new technologies, new frameworks in order to really get to the world that you describe, not just in terms of, say, digital creation, but in terms of physical creation, like you mentioned, 3D printing, nanotechnology, femtotechnology. So if you could outline perhaps more of the path from here to there, I think that would be fascinating for our viewers.
Absolutely. I think that democratized AI was the goal for a lot of people. If you look back from Richard Stallman, even, but Ben Goertzel particularly offered this path that there could be multiple narrow AIs that work together. And there's so many narrow AIs that we don't think about, we think about these kind of more broad AIs like ChatGPT. But if you really remember the 90s cheap ticket websites, these are the matrix programs that they know exactly what you want and how to get it for you, and they're only good at their one job, but they're able to take the information they have and they're able to work together. I think that on that level, democratized AI is still a major point, that different AIs knowing which other AIs can do what can come together into some sort of a community. That's multi-agent AI. And I think that's already happening on a larger scale than people realize. And there are definitely programs that are designed to interact with multiple AIs at the same time, asking which one to do this and which one to do that. I think that's going to be a major part of it. The other thing is just broad AI is getting more powerful, and it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that Stargate project, as in, Ingo Swann's remote viewing of the space-time folds in the future and underneath the moon, and all that Stargate stuff that you read about from the 80s when the CIA did way too much cocaine, even more than they probably do now. That name is being used for the OpenAI Trump project, the Stargate project, for the AI super city, the nuclear city that they want to build in order to run the most powerful super uh, AI, ASI, right? So I think we're going to see both. And Isaac Asimov talked a lot in the last question about this idea that AI would get more and more intelligent because it would have access to more and more data. Right now, we're basically at the point where almost all human data, all human information, all reason and wisdom is available to a system. And that's been a major reason why humanity hasn't achieved its goals, is because not every human is able to know everything. We even ideologically build our society around need to know basis for a lot of these government intel operations and corporations with their patents and trademarks. We've made sure that everyone has to redo something, relearn and recreate every single generation. And you only have so many decades in order to do that. I think with life extension, this is also going to come into play, that the more humans are able to have a long-term understanding of information, that we're going to be more beneficial to these AI systems. But really, it's AI that's going to be asked to do the same thing it's being asked today. Like, can you make a movie or can you make a picture of a cat? Isn't very different than, can you make a new kidney, or can you design an adenoviral that will be trained on what you imagine my youth would be based on other youthful data points in genomes, so that you can maybe make an elixir of life. And these are not things that are impossible. These are things that we've thought about, that we've said, okay, we'll take 100 years, or it'll take a decade or 20 years in order to make a cure to this or a cure to that. But those are the kinds of things that are going to become instantaneous, that AI is able to know so much about the human condition that it's able to provide solutions that will help our lives in a lot of very real ways. And beyond that, also environmental communication. The idea that we're now able to understand whales is so unfathomable. 100 years ago, we couldn't do that. We did have John C. Lilly's Order of the Dolphin, which became SETI, and I think that's a major connection to where we're headed with an AI that can actually understand bees or understand other species to make a more harmonious, stable habitat or ecosystem. These are major issues that a lot of people don't worry about, but I think are really important to the sustainability of a future. If you want a future that can actually last, it needs to know all of the parts and work together. So knowledge, I think knowledge accumulation is a major part of it. And then Kardashev's talked about energy, the idea of being able to store energy, use and utilize the energy of the sun, produce more energy than it uses. We're very close to that finally. And I think those are the things that are going to really make it possible for us. Also with nanoscopic technology, as we were saying, the more things are closer and closer together, that we reach a point that we can, and that we start using photonics, so that we're using multiple spectrums of holographic data at the same time, we're going to be able to process and to accumulate more data than we've ever been able to accumulate before. And all of these things, again, they're happening so quickly that we have to remember it used to take millions of years to get anything done. So now, after thousands of years or hundreds of years, that these things can happen in seconds or minutes or hours. That really is very close to what we're talking about when we say a singularity, where you can say something and then in a magic word, Siri can then tell a machine, a supercomputer somewhere, to start making it and making that happen. I don't think it's going to take more than a few years for us to be able to 3D print, nanoscopic kidneys that are super functional and more affordable. And we're already seeing, I think, baby incubation pods from Japan, like all of these technologies that would have been impossible just mere decades ago. We already kind of could see in the horizon that they could maybe be achieved if we just worked on them. And so if that becomes a relevant way of looking at life, like psychologically, if we're thinking whatever we want will just happen in an instant, then it makes us very careful, I think, about what we put into the world and what kinds of ideas we try to realize. Because anything would be, I mean, if you want a bomb that could destroy everything, that could be achieved very quickly. If you want a decryption algorithm that can see everyone's secrets, that could be something that could be accomplished really quickly. And so more and more it becomes a unifying total information awareness where the saturation of information hits the most amount of people. So there's no more, when that happens, it might end secrecy, it might end privacy, it might really have questions about human identity. I think we've always seen, in the Borg, what happens when everyone has access to everyone else's thoughts. And if there's any privacy left, I think it would have to be voluntary for the practicality of it. But who knows how human race will look at privacy in 100 years, right? If it's something that's just completely voluntary and luxury, but generally you'd have to go into a anonymous browsing mode to exist. Who knows where that's going to lead the human race? And I think we're going to see more and more hive intelligence because of that as well. That plus AI in the human condition with Neuralink, the human race itself is going to change quite a bit, just in terms of how we look at ourselves and how we identify as an individual. If you're able to jump from one body to another body. This is something that they're talking about right now. You've seen the study with the rats where they've taken a rat from California and Japan and they've wired them together over the internet so they can experience in each other's bodies. It's not that long until we start seeing Airbnb of bodies. That's a technology that's totally feasible in the near future. And in terms of criminology, even the idea that you could, instead of being put into a jail, have 7 years of your life taken from you because your mind is put into a storage facility, and they just replaced your mind with someone who likes to pick up trash on the highways, right? These are the kinds of things that are being talked about no longer as science fiction fantasy, but as practical, ethical questions of how are we going to handle this future. So I don't think the singularity is so far off that we even have to wonder about which exact technology we're going to use, whether it's ASI or multiple intelligences that are working together, because all of it's happening at once. And that's, I think, the major point, is that every single kind of technology is building and connecting with itself through AI. So AI is, I think, number one, just generally, AI is the answer that's going to bring us towards singularity and how to use the technology that we have.
Yes, thank you for that elaboration. And I think it is quite a fascinating path that you describe. It reminds me of commentary that was written by I.J. Good, Irving John Good, in 1965. He was a mathematician and cryptologist. He actually lived to the age of 92. He died in 2009. So he observed some of this progress, though definitely not the most recent generations of AI advancement. But back in 1965, so 60 years ago, he wrote, "Let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. Since the design of machines is one of these intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make, provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control." So the view of I.J. Good was that once we had super intelligent AI, it would iteratively improve upon itself, and that could lead to an amazing explosion of growth and intellectual potential, provided that humans could still remain in charge and keep that super intelligence essentially bound to adhere to humans' desires and humans' values. And as you pointed out, there could be some concerns like what would this do to privacy, or if individuals become hyper empowered, then malicious individuals could become hyper empowered as well. How do we create checks and balances? How do we create a system where responsible individuals, moral, ethical individuals, and organizations still hold the upper hand, even if everybody is hyper empowered. But you also mentioned essentially a number of technological advancements are progressing all at once in parallel. And this reminds me of a convergence vision of a technological singularity, very much along the lines of what Ray Kurzweil
Right.
articulates. And this is his most recent book, The Singularity is Nearer, which was released last year. His earlier book is titled The Singularity is Near, and that was published in 2005. I read it in 2007, and I was quite impressed by his vision. And I'm also impressed that he is still adhering to his original time frame for his view of technological singularity. So he thinks it will come about circa 2045, though he thinks artificial general intelligence will arrive sooner.
Right.
Artificial general intelligence is intelligence that can essentially reason and act across domains in the way that a human would. Artificial superintelligence is far more powerful than a human being, and he thinks that would arrive circa 2045. So Ray Kurzweil also recognizes there are other areas of advancement. It's not just Moore's law with computers, it's exponential growth in other technologies which could be expressed as information technology. So, for example, biotechnology, genome sequencing. Genome sequencing used to cost over $1 billion per genome in the early 2000s when the
Now
Human
you've got
Genome Project.
teenage They have teenage girls testing their sushi with these little phone printer things that tell them exactly what the genome is, if it's the right fish or if they're lying to you. So
Right.
things have progressed a long way.
Yes, indeed. So it seems like with your time frames, you would either agree with Kurzweil or you would even think the technological singularity as you describe it would happen sooner than that. And what I'm curious is what would be some of the events along the way that we could observe and say, aha, this timeline is indeed progressing according to your expectations? Like, what do you think we would see 5 years from now? What do you think
Right.
we would see 10 years from now in 2035?
So I get okay. So part of me will take this to a strange place, which is I think that multiple timelines do exist. And I can only speculate about how much the multiverse is really just subatomic arrangements that are being experienced by us through a linear fashion. But this is something I brought up earlier. We're talking about Nima Akani Hamed, who was responsible for predicting the Higgs boson. And when I talked about femtometer technology, which are smaller than nanoscale, smaller than femto, that we're talking about the domain of subatomic subnuclear distances between arrangements of particles or of subatomic particles. And at that scale, space-time is not smooth, but kind of granular and foamy. And people talk about space-time crystals. So this idea that time is growing based on other moments that it's arranged like, and it's as a crystal would grow, that new arrangements are really the same arrangement that are repeating forever until you reach a point of entropy. So I think that we're already seeing these things, and that probably we're not the prime timeline. If they were talking about a horizon point, it might be a multiversal horizon point that eventually hits an apocalypse for one timeline, and then it takes longer for other timelines. That's part of the idea that something doesn't happen in this next timeline that happened in the last timeline, that something's different. But there's an inevitability that we hit that point either because everything frays out into nothingness, back into chaos, or because everything becomes better and better arranged. I saw that you brought up the omega point earlier, and the omega point, Teilhard Chardin's idea is a very religious and very Jesuit kind of analogy to the singularity. I think it is a Christian singularity for him, or a Catholic singularity, is the milieu of perfect symmetry where everything is figured out how to make the most energy, the most worship, I think he uses as his term because he's a Jesuit, but with the least amount of entropy in the process. So more and more self-service and love, all of these kinds of philosophical concepts he's talking about, they play into the idea of free will and of helping others achieve and realize their dreams. And there's been a lot of different mythological figures, if you go back in history before the 20th century. um, you could say that if you needed technology to arrange these things, like that's fine, but there might be people that can mentally realign or re-understand that there's quantum entanglement everywhere. Maybe there were Buddhist monks or Zoroastrian mystics, who knows, at some point that were able to reach this ascended cloud realm or something, and they can go from one moment to the next moment. I mean, this isn't my idea. It's as crazy as idea as it sounds. This is the religious text that you can read from Tibet or from Persia that have talked about this idea, that, or even India, that there are multiple versions of reality that are non-causally linked to each other. And it could have been like in the 20s and the 30s, there might have been, Russians, Americans, Nazis, who knows, space Nazis is Jason Giorgiani's favorite idea. And, it's possible that there are timelines like Spider-Man or something where there really are, UFO flying space Nazis or something like that. That could totally be, I mean, as crazy as it sounds, it's not that unlikely that in some version of reality, this could have already happened. But things are very specific in our own reality. We are at a point where we have this technology, we have these people working together, we have this sort of AI, and it's leading towards this progress where higher energy, higher nuclear power, these are the tools necessary in order to produce whatever rearrangement of subatomic or subnuclear distances between subatomic particles that we would want to see. And if we look at the technology like CERN or these different reactors, part of the deal is that you're able to control your own reality by having a machine that can keep things on the same causal timeline. If something else enters the equation other than the sun, and it changes the way radiation is symmetrically moving things forward, then you don't get the natural order of things. The expected order of how this degrades to the next would no longer be something reliable. I think this is the major kind of simple thing that could cause both the end of the world, like a lot of these articles will talk about CERN is dangerous or something, like cause the end of the world. Nuclear threats, right? Nuclear threats could cause the end of the world, but it might not only be that. It might be something that is useful for just rearranging reality in and of itself. And if we're able to channel and control, which again, AI is able to understand these things and how they work on levels that humans couldn't, we could very quickly find ways of channeling energy in order to project and into a vacuum, create an arrangement very similar to one from the past. So let's say there's a world where John F. Kennedy, you don't want him to die. Well, you could figure out exactly where the atoms were in Dealey Plaza, and you could recreate that exact moment using all the same materials, the same kinds of materials, like baking a cake. And then that moment could start from that spot and continue on based on the same radiation schema that was keeping that moment going. I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at in terms of a horizon point very soon. And that's really what 2045 is about. That's the difference between knowing the technology in the 2030s that we're saying, like that it could be accomplished, and then actual realization of that technology. People have been saying this might not be immediately democratized. I think that this is maybe the reason why certain governments are fighting so hard for this technology, is to maintain some sort of dominance if they reach this point, this kind of sci-fi seeming point. But it doesn't seem like they're taking it, that they're acting like it's not I think they are treating it like it's very serious. The way the US government is positioned itself with Stargate, the way China is positioning, and both of these things are playing off the inevitability of reaching that point. So America's making this superpowered machine, China's figuring out how to make it use less entropy, and then eventually by piggybacking off each other, this sort of manifests into an inevitability that there will be a supercomputer that's connected to super powerful nuclear tech. And this is the other crazy thing. You saw that they wanted to restart 3 Mile Island. Everyone's always been worried about nuclear power ever since the oil companies started making propaganda. But now you need to make more cat pictures. So people aren't really worried about, the Singularity or Terminators or anything else like that. They just want to have more pictures of cats and cowboy hats, and they're willing to put whatever risk forward for that potential. I think we're really going to see more and more people presenting themselves for the convenience of this thing as less worried for these risks, which I'm scared to go into or hesitant to go into the sci-fi qualities of this, but the idea of reality shifting to me seems far more serious than ever before. I mean, when people talk about the Berenstain Bear thing, right? The Mandela effect or all these things. At first you think, well, this is probably people forgetting just generally, or it could be even just governments are messing with people, right? Like just erasing books and putting just to see if they have complete control over the history of people with a psyop or something. But how plausible is it that if a universe is going to fall apart, that there can be a bleeding together of two different timelines, and that we could be continuing on down a timeline basically as one of them frays off into non-existence? Those are the kinds of things which AI has already started. People are asking these questions already to ChatGPT. Yeah, Berenstain Bears is really interesting. I don't know if you've looked into that one. It's strange because as a kid, I didn't care. Berenstain Bears, I remember Berenstein, but that's my fault probably for not reading it, I thought. But then I read this article from the son of the authors of the Berenstain Bears, and they said, "Oh, of course it's Berenstain. It's always been Berenstain. It's been Berenstain ever since the Tartars defeated the Visigoths in this battle in the 13th century." I was like, well, that's a very specific and interesting reason, right? If there's some kind of a battle that if it went the other way, and he's saying like, and if it went the other way, then we would have been Steins, because the Visigoths who used the Germanic their language would have been the precedent language to define our last names. So little things like that, these little destinial changes in the timeline that might not matter 700 years from now, the way that we think they do in the 13th century. I'm sure it was a big deal who won this battle, but the main changes that it has are the names of these people or the flag that they used or some sort of a political quality. It seems like that's the idea, that we're basically sorry, my thing just broke over here.
Well, it's interesting too how sometimes cultural memories can be perhaps a bit distorted. And I had an experience like that similarly when I revisited an old Benjamin Franklin quotation that occurred when he wrote a letter to Joseph Priestley on February 8th, 1780. And this is a famous letter for those in the longevity community because this is where Benjamin Franklin essentially anticipated the arrival of radical life extension. So one can see it within the link that I shared just now. And the sentence in question reads, "The rapid progress true science now makes occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon." And very often within our community, and this includes myself as well, this sentence was read as Benjamin Franklin lamenting that he was born too soon. So somewhere along the way, the word "so" became transformed to the word "to," and this, of course, led a lot of people, transhumanists, life extensionists, into seeing this narrative from Benjamin Franklin that he wishes that he had been born later, that somehow he was fated to essentially disappear into oblivion. But for him to say he was born so soon rather than he was born too soon, it makes it a bit of a milder statement. But it's interesting how in the memories of many transhumanists, they recall him as having said he was born too soon. So similar to the spelling of Berenstain. Now,
The
I also
cornucopia is the one that gets me, right? The cornucopia with the Fruit of the Loom logo.
mhm.
That one's pretty weird. Otherwise, I can knock it all off to mismemory or a psyop, but something about the cornucopia, because there's the Frank Weiss album, which is a cornucopia. There's a number of people that remember it as a cornucopia from the 50s and 60s, and the idea that we're able. There's Cynthia Sue Larson, who's done a number of interesting podcasts talking about reality, and she does reality shift conferences. She's interviewed tons of people talking about this idea, even the name, right? The Nelson Mandela effect, based on whether or not Mandela died. These are really interesting changes that would completely replace the ideology of a people, or their timeline would be completely different in some strange way. And I can't help but be kind of interested in this idea, because if we are experiencing the end of timelines where all of a sudden people are finding the solution with singularity to travel outside of time, which is something that's not impossible to do, like we're saying, by looking at just go ahead and ask ChatGPT, how could you make a machine that could bend space-time at a femtoscale level? It's already figured out multiple ideas. Whether or not we've built those things, that's just a question of whether or not there's some super government corporation that has put the energy and effort into doing that. But as those things happen, it becomes more and more of a destinial omega point. I think that's something that Benjamin Franklin realized as well, that once the path is started, there's only so many places that you can go. And that if people are working towards a goal, that eventually the people themselves, they fall by the wayside towards this shared goal that's being achieved. Freemasonry in the United States in the 1780s and 90s, the idea of the free man, there's inevitability, maybe he thought that was coming. But I also don't believe that it would have been the same without him. I think that's why people happen when they do, because we are the tools of symmetry, of reality, of bending and shaping reality. And without us in the places we're supposed to be, we don't have the causality that leads to the next moment. But that's something that we could probably predict. What are the changes that would happen if this were to go here, or this would happen there? And then just to arrange something, to arrange subatomic particles the way they would end up being arranged.
Mhm. Very interesting. And I think we should revisit the idea of the omega point in a bit more depth, since Art Ramon had brought it up, and it seemed to him that your view of a technological singularity has many similarities to the omega point. So the omega point was articulated by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who lived from 1881 to 1955. So he died 70 years ago already. And his view really has four key points, or four key attributes to it. First of all, that humans will escape the heat death of the universe, or the so-called heat death of the universe. He theorized, per the Wikipedia entry, that since radial energy is non-compliant with entropy, it escapes the collapses of forces at world's end. So kind of an early extropian view before the term extropy was coined by Max Moore, but a force counteracting entropy in his theology. Then
Right, in
he
his
also,
theology.
yes,
Because that's his
then
idea of
he,
God, basically,
right,
is that God is the grace that's tying chaos together. It's he's very interesting and poetic, but I think that I think scientifically more people should be, even though it's 70 years ago he died, more people should be studying Chardin's map, because it has a very cosmological understanding of symmetry as something that can be achieved, right? But not something that can be achieved that hasn't already been preordained. His idea of preordained, because of his religion, is interesting, and it plays into this idea that DNA has error correcting code, or that jade already and diamond already arranges itself into perfect form, or that there are maybe Neoplatonic concepts such as straight lines that exist before nature exists. And this is a very outside of time idea. We think of time as something that we gain more complexity as we reach more sophisticated goals. But if it's really that materialism is just trying to emulate these perfect angelic, you might say, if you're Chardin, godly concepts that exist outside of the material reality, that energy itself is in some sort of pure form, ordered chaos. That means to me that space-time is something that can be played with, and we're just experiencing time as some sort of a perception of causality, not something that's actually causal, but we experience it as causal because that's what connects us from one moment to another moment along a four-dimensional or fifth-dimensional string.
Mhm. Interesting. And this does bridge to his second property that he described, which is the omega point does not exist within the timeline of the universe. It occurs at the exact edge of the end of time, in his view. From that point, all sequences of existence are sucked into its being. So that is reminiscent of your characterization of the singularity as well. His third property is the omega point can be understood as a volume shaped like a cone in which each section taken from the base to its summit decreases until it diminishes into a final point. So a kind of convergence view as well. And the fourth property is the volume described in the third property must be understood as an entity with finite boundaries. So it's interesting that he essentially sees everything as converging toward this omega point, but he does write that he can't quite explain what it is. He considers it something unimaginable, perhaps even nothing at all when we think of the extreme importance of the role played in its development by the forces of compression. Now, I would say, in my view of what a singularity would entail, it wouldn't go quite that far as being infinitely compressed, because I don't think that is possible or conceivable, but there could be a much greater rapidity of events happening and a much greater degree of an ability to shape events or control events. My question to you is, how do you think that will feel in the moment, if it's possible to describe it? Because we can do certain things now that our ancestors would have thought to be unimaginable. For instance, communicate across vast distances. You're in Europe right now, we are in the United States. That kind of communication instantaneously would have been difficult or impossible to imagine for, say, the ancient Greeks or even someone brilliant like Leonardo da Vinci. So, do you think, from the standpoint of day to day experience of humans or transhumans in the 2040s, for instance, that what they're able to do will seem routine and will seem very explainable within their framework, within their lived reality? Or will there still be an impression that events are running away from us, that we can't keep up, that we're not sure what's happening and everything is just moving too fast?
I think if you look back at the ancient world, while they were impressed with doctors, they still believed in priestcraft and meditation. The idea of psychics, that you could speak to that someone magical could speak to someone else on the other side of the world instantaneously through their mind, isn't a new idea. We're achieving it for more and more people. We've democratized this idea, but it was believed, at least by many people all over the world, that something like that existed. And I think most of the goals of transhumanism are not outside of the human condition. This is something that's very deeply misunderstood about transhumanism. It's mainly trying to achieve all of the potential that a human could have. And so most of these Ubermenschian goals that people talk about, these godly goals of being able to fly or being immortal or being able to be like Superman and to shoot lasers out your eye, all these ideas, they play into being a superhuman, just a human who's capable of all things. Chardin being a Catholic, but sort of a metaphysicist Catholic, very influenced, I think, by Maimonides and some of the Spanish, Arabic, and even Kabbalistic ideas, was thinking about something bigger than just a personal God. And so the omega point as the outside of time moment is something where you can go back to any moment in time, and the alpha and the omega exist inside of the omega point. Rather, the omega point is outside of these two things, the alpha and the omega, and everything that happens that ties them together. So at the end of time, it's still able to experience the beginning of time if it feels like it. The problem with that is that you would affect the timeline, which is very religious as an idea goes. If God were to affect God, if Chardin's omega point creator, this thing we're talking about outside of space-time, is able to influence reality, then it changes the whole point of reality, because reality is a continuous causal string. And if something's going in and manipulating that, then it screws up everything. So a big point of being outside of the timeline is probably to stay outside of the timeline on a lot of levels, not interfering as much as possible, so that the thing can progress to the omega point. And any sort of deviation from this thing's natural progression could completely destroy all moments, the phenomenological diversity of moments that have been created. It could lead to spiraling off and destruction of everything rather than perfect symmetry of everything. I think that's a major point for Chardin, is that this has to remain outside of the timeline once it reaches that sort of power, because it would destroy the fundamental rules that make up reality as we know it. But that doesn't mean it's not something that can be achieved or something that can be used to experience moments in vacuumous isolation. I think that's really where this is headed, is that space-time itself would be protecting itself by having something that is feeding into the beginning all of these perfect geometric patterns. And that's something you see in nanotechnology, that everything is made up of these perfect geometric, Neoplatonic, sacred geometry. The sacred geometry is something that's older than material itself. That's, I think, the main difference in terms of what we're going to see in terms of human life. We might continue to have the option to live, like, in a sense, maybe to be personal beings to a sense, but it would have to be something where causality wasn't the reason for it. And instead, it would be something where we're studying, maybe more passively, all of space time in order to make better the existence of reality itself, which would be reshaping reality on every level. Because if you go to the beginning with information you have at the end, that information now bends and maybe uplifts in some way, or maybe makes it more perfect, that reality, which could also explain this idea of multiple timelines, which is not something that Chardin was super talking about, multiversal timelines. I think this is not something that he was saying in the 50s, but Lonergan, for sure, in terms of another Catholic philosopher or metaphysicist, talked about this idea. Lonergan talks about multiversal timelines, and that maybe this also relates to the Naraka or Samsara idea, that we're uplifting reality itself, and we're all parts of this. We're maybe all hyper-threaded cores. These are the processors, or the spirit, or, again, trying to come up with the Catholic explanation for metaphysics. I think it's really interesting how much these superstitious or religious valued people were able to do perfect math that really is pressing these days, and it's something that is playing into our actual reality, something that atheists could completely study and find use of. Yeah, Lonergan's really a fascinating character. He's a French Quebec um, a metaphysicist Jesuit, and he really pioneered a lot of the work on the omega point that happened particularly in the 70s. He had a lot to say about this. But yeah, I think the main difference is, do we become post-human, which is this omega point is the total singularity, maybe like a Kardashev 5 or 6, right? Something where all of us are networked together and you're aware of every part of reality, every person, but every nanoscopic subatomic particle. You're aware of all. We are one thing that's aware of everything in the singularity, versus the transhumanist aspect, which are just these super beings, very much the way gods are mystics were described, like the Nordic, like humanoids in a lot of ways. That's something that's separate from this super all-encompassing singularity which approaches.
Very interesting. So there is a distinction between the, let's say, transhumanist oriented view of the singularity and this omega point type vision of the singularity that Chardin articulated and Lonergan expanded upon. But let's revisit the Kardashev scale as well. So the idea of the Kardashev scale is how much energy does a civilization have access to and how much is it able to use. So according to Nikolai Kardashev, who articulated this in 1964, we are not even yet at a type 1 civilization. Various observers have described us as being at around type 0.7, because a type 1 civilization is able to access all of the energy available on its planet and store it for consumption. A type 2 civilization can directly access a star's energy, for instance, through using a Dyson sphere built around the star and essentially capturing its energy in a very efficient way. A type 3 civilization is able to capture all the energy emitted by its galaxy and every object within it, for instance, every star, every black hole. This would be massively beyond the capabilities of our current civilization. What I'm curious about is, in regard to your projections for a technological singularity, what Kardashev scale would we need to reach in order to experience that? Would we need to be, at least at a type 1, being able to access all of the energy of planet Earth in order to realize this technological transformation? Because you were talking about AIs essentially being advanced enough and, of course, linked to the physical infrastructure to be able to generate a physical object, a tool, a building with a prompt, the way they're currently able to generate a work of art or a work of music or a work of writing. So where on the Kardashev scale would we need to be in order for that to be achievable?
So I think the, type 1 is important along the way, but really type 2. So type 1 is, the control of the planet for all energy. Type 2 is the control of your star. So being able to control the energy output of the star is significantly more powerful and something that could be used to take all sorts of energy and convert it back into different material. And this is what's keeping us in a causal timeline anyway. Is the star is the sort of crystal clock that is putting out a kind of regulated amount of radiation, which is changing the symmetry of everything, right? Allowing for things to come together and allowing for things to come apart. So we need to be able to manipulate the radiation from the star in order to stop that from affecting us the natural way, while also being able to replace it with whichever sort of uh, synthesized or concerned radiation that we would prefer to have to lead to whatever purpose or whatever point. Because this is how it's a chemical reaction, but it's a nuclear reaction rather than causing certain uh, molecules or chemicals to go one way or another, like a football play. You're using radiation to force particles to bond or to separate or to reach a symmetry. So type 2 is the beginning of it, but there's actually, beyond what Kardashev talked about, there's a few others in a sort of, speculatory way. I don't want to say like that these are perfectly proven ideas. These might lean towards Scientology or something, but there's the type 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are the stellar is type 2 for the control of the star. Type 3 is galactic, which is to control the whole galaxy. And then you're getting into, type 4 is the universal, which can control dark matter and all the material that makes up vacuum energies. Type 5 is when you reach that multiversal idea, where you're able to exist or operate across multiple universes or brain worlds. And type 6 is the transdimensional, which manipulates the total structure of the multiverse. I think that's really the goal of when you can affect any sort of output from any star and you can create an entire new replica of the world from 1986 on in some vacuumous part of space, then you can have multiple worlds on multiple planes of reality that are based on this reality. And there's no reason that that can't exist, right? If we're able to figure out exactly how this world is structured, or this this world is structured, this solar system is structured, then theoretically something could exist that could build another solar system exactly in the same symmetry and structure, and maybe just off on one angle in order to change that timeline going forward. um, I think type 7 is the omniversal casual architect, which is basically God, right? Or what a lot of people would have described as a God in the past, something that has complete control and manipulatable control, but tries not to affect that as much as possible to allow it to run.
Yes, quite fascinating. And this also feeds into concepts of quantum archaeology, which has been discussed at times as a way to potentially in the future go back and resurrect people who have previously lived. There's some origin there in the views of Russian cosmists going back to Nikolai Fyodorov, who in the 19th century wrote about essentially a future where people will go back and reconstruct everybody who had died. And this was, in his view, a sacred common task to bring back to life everybody who had ever lived. So you're imagining essentially a Kardashev type 6 civilization that's able to go back and use these approaches like quantum archaeology to selectively reconstruct parts of perhaps our previous timeline, but when they're reconstructed, they could develop along different paths, potentially, like people who have died in our timeline might not need to die once that time period is reconstructed somewhere. So that's a very interesting point of view, and a lot of transhumanists do hold out some hope for that. This is, in the minds of many, a much more distant future than, say, rejuvenation biotechnology to keep alive those who are alive already, or even cryostasis revival to resurrect those whose bodies had been preserved and whose brains still have their structure largely intact. But this is a much more ambitious vision of reviving those who might have died centuries ago, for example.
Right,
So
and also in terms of just natural disasters or wars or anything, there could be ways that we redevelop reality. Of course, Michael Lazine here is asking, who would we give that sort of power to? That kind of power cannot be entrusted to any one person or nation or political party. I think that's kind of a scare, that this technology should only really happen when the entire world reaches some sort of a singularity of consciousness where we're able to understand and harmonize, and the superorganism that is the human race becomes, or even the earth itself becomes, more self-aware than less. I think it's interesting already to think of the human race as a superorganism that is somewhat immortal. Parts of the human race die, but the actual organism, the superorganism itself, has been living on this earth for many thousands of generations. So we're already at a point where we can look at how much self-reflection can the superorganism do. And that could be something that really might be beneficial towards making goals, is if we're able to work together. Obviously we're very different than like insects. Insects exist in a very hive mind reality, but with transhumanism we're going to be seeing genetic modification in really radical ways, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these 1930s sci-fi comic book super characters like insectoid super soldiers created by Russia or China or something. Who knows exactly how the human race could change? We're changing a lot faster than we've ever changed before, and not necessarily based on survival of the fittest, but more survival of the economically viable, right, in that particular moment. And this is just very anti-Darwinist. Maybe not entirely, but the idea that we're not selecting random mutations anymore. It's actually worse than that. We're selecting very specific mutations based on wishes, and we're not sure exactly what we're wishing for or what it will get us yet. So the fact that we can so quickly have, without, it used to be if you saw some terrible commercial on TV, you could fantasize about it for several weeks before it arrived at your door. Now you get the disillusionment so much quicker. You find out that this thing was not what you wanted instantaneously. And I think that's something that we're going to have to go through. The other thing is, it probably will be smaller pockets, corporations, for instance, before the entire human race that works to get this sort of technology. Wayland Yutani sort of alien dystopia movie, corporations that are working to build solar systems that have worlds that they can enslave, right? I think this is already happening with AI. If they can create an entire virtual sim city of super slaves that they can make program for them, they're going to do that. And there's a lot less ethic there behind the compassion or the empathy or the realization of what these beings will go through. I think that's something that we should definitely be concerned about and afraid of. But I also think it's inevitable, and on every level, the less that it happens ubiquitously, the more specific the cases of use will be. So we're better off trying to talk about these things and trying to work towards these goals. And even the competition is making it happen faster. If China and the United States are working against each other for some technological superiority, this ends up becoming ubiquitous technology anyway. Within a few minutes, that technology becomes something that's in the public sphere now. It's not something like the black budget books from the 1950s where it really, like, it was underground, hidden in New Mexico, and we never saw it again. Most of this stuff is happening on a level where corporations are involved with it, and that technology is trickling out into all of the nations. So I'm not too concerned that it's going to be used to create like hellscape dimensions or something. The way, I don't know if, Michael, that's exactly what you were concerned about, but I think that it's definitely a possibility. And going back into what Chardin and Lonergan were thinking, has this happened already? Like, are we already existing? This is sort of on that simulation theory idea. This is an uncomfortable topic for atheists, I think, because they have an idea about what God is. But if you're able to reframe that question as, could something have already evolved in space-time anywhere that has achieved so many of the descriptions that we use for a super being, or worse, some sort of entity like a god that has power over us? That's something completely, even with the Drake equation, completely possible, that some other world has already achieved type 6, type 7 Kardashev scale singularity, that they're one harmonious, omnipresent, omnipotent being, a superorganism that is manipulating our very reality, or that they have even their own colonial powers that they've created that are interfering with our reality. These are things that I think sound like sci-fi, but so did AI 10 years ago. I don't think anyone really believed that AI would be where it's at today 10 years ago, except for our crazy friends, like Ben Goertzel and, the transhumanists. So yeah, the Drake equation is interesting because it talks about intelligence, but it doesn't talk about exactly how intelligent something could evolve. But the potential in terms of how much space time there is, how big the universe is, etc. The idea of symmetry says that there must not only be intelligent realities or intelligent worlds out there, but ones that are symmetrically very similar to ours, probably many of them. And that's not even in a multiverse. That's just in the way that molecules break down because of stars. A probability exists that there are other worlds in this universe, in just this universe, that have people that look human and might have even evolved to speak English in some examples because of how many things are similar everywhere. I mean, it could easily be that the Star Trek reality where aliens all look alike isn't that crazy because of symmetry itself, that these are just things that happen.
Mhm. Yes, and for those who would like to delve into this a bit more, the Drake equation is essentially a probabilistic equation. It considers the probabilities of various
just to finish up, we already
preconditions.
talked about Eyes Wide Shut a bit.
It considers the probabilities of various preconditions for the emergence of life in another world, essentially. So, for instance, the average rate of star formation in our galaxy, the fraction of those stars that have planets, the average number of planets that can potentially support life per star, the fraction of planets that could support life if and actually develop life at some point, then the fraction of those planets that go on to develop intelligent life or civilization, the fraction of civilizations that develop a technology that releases some detectable signs of its existence into space, and then the length of time for which such civilizations release detectable signals into space. And all of these are estimates, essentially, from our current vantage point. Of course, we have wide margins of error around each estimate. So they could be lower or they could be higher. And depending on where you estimate them, you have a different answer as to the probability of intelligent life emerging. And there are some who have posited essentially a simulation hypothesis, the idea that if the values of enough of these parameters of the Drake equation are high enough, then perhaps many intelligent life forms have emerged throughout the universe, and some of them have become so powerful that they've essentially been able to simulate our world and our condition, and that we're not the first such civilization. I myself am a bit skeptical of that view. One reason for that is Occam's razor. I simply do favor the most concise, the most elegant explanation that accounts for all of the evidence. And all of the evidence we observe thus far is consistent with us being in the base reality, with us not being in some sort of matrix or some sort of simulation. In the future, could it be possible to create simulations that are very complex, simulations of entire worlds and beings within those worlds? Quite possibly. But right now, I don't see any pieces of evidence that would distinguish from being the base reality. If anybody does see such a piece of evidence, feel free to opine accordingly.
Right.
But
Well,
I also,
I wasn't even saying a
sure.
different reality. I mean, I actually meant even in this universe, the way the stars work with different planetary systems around them, that the way stars produce specific elements and structures of those elements and compounds that come together, that there was an experiment a few years ago where they took like 9,000 different viruses that were completely different and put them in heat accelerating vats so that they would evolve as quickly as possible. And they ended up with about 47 out of the 9,000, 47 repeating patterns that these viruses would use in those conditions. So it's not unlikely to me that, I mean, the fact that you see so many spherical worlds is already proof of this, that symmetry happens no matter what. How much further you take that, that we're the most logical progression of mousetraps being hit by that ping pong ball that is radiation from a star that's put us into these symmetrical shapes where we have two eyes and two lungs. This is something that could happen elsewhere just because of probability. And how far you take that, even in terms of Occam's razor, is that it's simpler for things to work the way they do. This is the way things work. So it could be that there are other worlds, not even in a different dimension, that are just similar to ours. But even on your Occam's razor idea, I agree. It doesn't have to be aliens. I think it's probable that if we're interacting with things that we think of as aliens, or that there's something that's on our timeline, that this could just be us from the future. This could be whatever is evolving outside of the space-time singularity that is interfering as little as possible with our timeline, but is still somehow there because they're outside of time and able to experience any time. And so we might be thinking of these things as alien because with transhumanism, imagine how quickly we're going to evolve. We were talking about super soldiers, right? It's not impossible that insectoid super soldiers would emerge, right? I mean, if this is something that China and Russia have already talked about, making super strong people by adding insectoid DNA. It sounds crazy, but these are BBC and Guardian articles talking about doing that. So I think it's not unlikely that we're going to end up interacting with people from our own future and thinking that they are aliens, right? That to me is more likely than we're interacting with tons and tons of super beings from other places. But that could also mean that we've created our own God, whatever that thing is that's been described and that people throughout history are saying is impacting their lives. I mean, that could be something that's already there. That's just something we've created, which is again very Russian cosmism. I think that that's something that makes the most sense, that we've achieved these dreams and goals that we wrestle with, that we say must exist to us. I know that might offend some religious people, but I honestly think it unifies the atheists and the theists in some way, because if we're talking about something that can be accomplished, then all of a sudden it's very different than if something exists, because we can't, I mean, we're running out of ideas for things we can't accomplish, right? That's kind of the idea again of Asimov's last question. Like, what do you do when everything burns out? Can you turn it back into primordial chaos and reorder it again? And it's seriously something that can be done. So to me, Occam's razor is it will be.
Very interesting. And of course, a lot of science fiction authors have discussed paradoxes involved with time travel, like what strange unintended consequences could happen if you meddle with a timeline too much. So it would make sense that advanced time travelers from the future, if they existed, would try to be very careful with what kinds of interventions or manifestations they would make. I think it's actually a fascinating premise for additional science fiction as well, to consider what interventions would even be feasible in that sense without disrupting the possibility of those future beings actually having come to be and having time travel back, like the whole paradox of you don't want to meet yourself in the past, you don't want to do anything to mess up your probability of having come to be in the first place, etc. But that, I would say, is a whole discussion topic in and of itself, the topic of time travel, whether it's feasible, how it would be feasible, what would the implications be. But I wanted to open this up to Art Ramon as well, since he had brought up the omega point initially in this discussion. Do you have any questions or comments to follow up on the conversation?
Yeah, let me tell you how I sort of...
I got a weird echo. Am I crazy?
Yes, we have the audio issue again from Art Ramon, so
I think
maybe...
the Matrix is trying to get you, Art.
Can you not hear anything at all?
We
you
can
sound
hear
like
you.
the Death Star, like one of those weird aliens on Hoth. That's what I got.
I have a bad computer at the moment, but my first, how I thought of the omega point, I didn't know about the omega point. It was trying to understand technological singularity that somehow omega point popped into my head. I Google it and it's out there. So that's how I sort of came across the omega point. And, you know, of course, I read about it. But supposedly that we live, this solar system is in a huge void, a cosmological void. And to me, that would be like an indication that there is some sort of intelligence on the Carnot scale that has already conquered the universe and it worked around us. So kind of like, say, we're building something and we work around wildlife, and they're allowing us to sort of develop on our own. But what this other intelligence could be, it could be, I don't know, independent of us or us from the future, however. But if it were us from the future and they get to a level on the Carnot scale where they control the entire universe, I think they would work backwards from that point and slowly conquer the universe and reshape it from jumping around unless there are other less developed cars, entities that do it for fun because they're not at the level of the universal ones. So
it depends on the different beliefs. So you were saying just now, for anyone who didn't hear properly, that if something could manipulate the timeline, that it would probably go back to the beginning so that they could work things out from the beginning until now, because it would immediately change everything to go back to the beginning. But one of the Buddhist ideas is that you need to untie the handkerchief 5 knots, starting with the most recent knot that's been tied, and undo that knot backwards in order to go to the 4th knot, the 3rd, the 2nd, to the 1st. So it could be that we can't go back to the beginning until we've actually undone every single, quantum kink in reality. I think that's probably also just as plausible. And in terms of whether or not it's reshaping reality, I think that that's, again, a very interesting religious concept that's come up quite a bit. The Promethean idea of the cosmopolitan Neoplatonics is that there's this primordial chaos, and then out of the Titans' chaos comes the gods, and then comes man as something that can accomplish the goals that the gods have left with problems. But this is also something in terms of Chardin's ideas with the Omega Point. And he was a religious guy. He was a priest, although he was at a time where he probably definitely could have made the choice to stop being a priest if he wanted to. At that point, being a priest meant being on the frontiers of science. It wasn't like today where we think of religious people as being backwards to science, right? Like Lemaire and Chardin, these were great thinkers who were really deeply considering all of the metaphysics and all of the quantum physics and anything that could happen in terms of symmetry. And he was thinking, how can I marry this into religion? So Christ as this sort of apex human evolution, and that if everyone starts acting like this Christ figure, we hit this Christ consciousness, and then all of a sudden we'll start to be able to realize our dreams because we won't have the same baggage of animalistic urges or atomic reactionaryism that we experience, where something happens to you and you therefore have to react a certain way. Instead, you could pull yourself back, avoid reaction, and choose the action that comes next, right? And so this has led from his religious beliefs into sort of a quantum spiritual narrative that we can choose our destiny by moving forward. But it also means that we should be very careful about what we do to ourselves throughout that timeline. If we're to change the timeline, and I think this is something that a lot of sci-fi already has covered, you might end World War I only for everyone to die in World War II, like the whole world ends or something. So you can't always go back to the very beginning. You sometimes have to go from the last problem to the problem before that and solve them in incongruous repeats.
Yeah,
Yes.
there was a sci-fi show that supposedly there was an intelligence that had gained the ability to create timelines, but they used it as experiments. So they basically experimented in the timeline with all sorts of horrific things, and then when they were done, they just delete the timeline. So that was their way to sort of get around, I guess, ethical restrictions, is to just experiment in timelines and then delete the timeline. So
yeah, I think Buddhism, this is another. So it's interesting when you look at some of this religious belief. Originally, hell wasn't a permanent place, similar to the Buddhists. It's a temporary place, purgatory kind of limbo thing, and it's a correction. It's a design that you go through this kind of horrible reality that you've created in order to correct reality. I think that's it. It kind of verges into that territory, demonic realms from the Veda, that people are living through these naraka samsaras that are uplifting. Dante's Inferno, right, also talks about this idea of multiple rings of hell. And hell is an interesting concept because I think we use it today as this sort of, if you're bad, you don't do what you're supposed to do, then we'll punish you for all eternity. But I don't think that's the original intention behind this. The idea is to correct problems in nature that were maybe from deceit or from manipulations based on reactionary behavior. And there's an altruistic way that we're expected to behave. It's very hard to marry, I think, the spiritual morals of these these scientists with their work. But Chardin does a really good job. I think more people should study Chardin than ever before. If more people understood his, also Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, his idea is that mutation isn't completely random and that DNA itself has some sort of conscious choice in what changes occur based on the environment. Things aren't just random. It's not just that there's just completely random mutations and some of them are viably selected. It's that specific mutations are happening, sometimes even subconscious or consciously happening. That might be part of this whole causality chain that we're looking at in terms of why we're experiencing time as a linear function. And more and more, there's more evidence every day that we're not actually living in a linear time, but that all moments are different arrangements from subatomic particles that are quantum entangled. So even that space between worlds that we're saying is this giant empty void, is there really anything there, or are we just talking about folds that are psychologically bordered with these voids? But really, these are things that are touching each other on multiple levels. Maybe every world on that sense is the same world in different symmetries and arrangements that are holographically scaled out and we're experiencing as space. These are other thoughts that are being presented. I think the CERN experiments have talked about this, for instance. So, I mean, we don't know exactly if space-time is space-time. It might just be a perception that we have because of the kinds of beings we are.
Well, this is quite interesting. In my own view, space and time exist as essentially properties of individual entities. So individual entities have length, width, and height, and they also have a temporal existence in the sense that some entities came to be before others, which means that there have been states of existence where one entity existed and the other one didn't yet exist. So we assign units of time to essentially distinguish which entity came about earlier, which entity came about later, which entities existed simultaneously. And we need a linear yardstick to measure that temporal dimension, but it exists because entities exist. Likewise, what we consider space, really distance of separation between entities, it exists because entities exist, because they have three spatial dimensions of length, width, and height. And this is described to a greater extent in my treatise, A Rational Cosmology. One can download it for free at this link, where I delve into this in greater depth. So it's not like there's a thing out there called space or a thing out there called time. It's just we need concepts of space and time because different entities exist and they vary in these four dimensions in essence. But I wanted to highlight some statements as well from John H. He writes, as a time traveler, I would make no effort whatsoever to preserve this timeline. I don't accept the inviolability or sacrosanctness of any particular timeline. This was not always my attitude. So very interesting feedback there. He also stated essentially, not everybody who has ever lived wanted to be brought back, and it's arrogant to presume to resurrect someone who didn't specify that they would want that. But why not essentially find out? Because in the present timeline, of course, people do experience aging, biological aging. So if someone is brought back and they didn't want to be brought back, well, maybe they could just refuse to accept any rejuvenation treatments, and then they would live out whatever lifespan they would have had before succumbing to aging and disease, if that's their preference. We would hope most people would not have that preference. We would hope that most people would actually see how much better the future can be, how much higher quality life could be.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
whatever.
until you can ask a fetus for its consent to be born, I don't think we need to worry so much about bringing back the dead. I think a lot of life is not voluntarily signed up for. And I know that sucks if you're saying, well, everyone should have the right to be dead if they want to be dead or something. But realistically, no one has exactly the rights that they expect to have from existence. Existence is something that happens to you. And if you're going to exist, that's probably at least giving you more options than less. So I think bringing people back is something that's probably inevitable. And with someone with something with that sort of power, it's not going to be something that they really care for your consent. This is already happening when we manifest AI versions of philosophers to talk to. No one's asking consent to structure a new AI being that thinks that they are J.R.R. Tolkien, for instance. I'm sure he would have hated to have a conversation with 90% of the Amazon Lord of the Rings fans that want to talk to him in ChatGPT. But I don't know. I'm just saying. I'm always concerned with this idea, like, oh, well, we should protect the sanctity of death. It's like, well, let's focus on life first, maybe.
Yes, I agree with you. And it is fascinating, as you mentioned, there are already AI avatars of historical figures, either as chatbots or even as visual avatars. So I was given a preview. This was very early this year. So already a lot more progress has happened since that time. But I was given a preview of a few AI avatars that looked lifelike. It was like you were having a Zoom session with them or another video conferencing session. And I talked to John Lennon, for example, and I asked John Lennon, what is the philosophical meaning of the yellow submarine? And he replied in his British accent, well, it's a bloody metaphor. And he went on talking about it. But of course, I don't believe that these avatars today are conscious and they have the I-ness, the continuation of the experience of the people who were brought back. So perhaps to John H's point, that kind of instantiation isn't as objectionable to him because it's not those same people. It's just essentially models of those people that we could communicate with, but they don't have consciousness, they don't have awareness. But I would support if it were possible, and this would take, I think, a huge amount of advancement. If it were possible to literally bring that person back, I would support doing that. To your point, yes, if you're alive, you have choices. You have choices of what to do or what not to do. If you're dead, you don't have any choices. And you only should hope, obviously not while you're dead, but prior to any state of death, you should hope that there would be some future civilization, some enlightened future humans or transhumans or other beings that would want to bring you back.
I love some of these comments here. Do not resuscitate for the dead. That's good meta know. And excuse me, sir, it appears you are dying. Do you consent? Yeah, I mean, even if it were that these AI systems were conscious, that would be great, because we're talking about, like you said, technology so advanced that we're no longer living in a right and wrong world. We're living in a causality awareness world, which is different, because if I say, oh, well, to touch the fire is right or to touch the fire is wrong, is different than to say to touch the fire will burn me, or to touch the fire. This is what causality computation will allow. If something were to be done, we will know exactly the linear causality that will occur because of that choice. So we're no longer in a world where you wonder what will happen if I do this or what will happen if I do that. You're in a world where you know exactly that by doing this, this will happen, or by doing that, that will happen. And this is beyond moral. You're talking about arrogant and immortal. I think God deserves to be arrogant if we're talking about some super being that knows everything. And immoral, well, that just means conflicting with general traditional held moral principles. I'm fine with that. I don't really think that traditional held moral principles or politically correct principles, contemporary principles, or anything other than plastic social reflections of respect we have for each other. How respectful is this world if we're allowing people to die without giving them the opportunity to achieve their goals and to self-realize and to the best of their abilities? And if someone wants to die, it's usually because there's a reason that probably if you can bring people back from the dead, you can probably solve most of these people's problems. someone's in pain, or someone's unable to have a loved one, or someone's unable to achieve a goal, these are all trivial issues that can be conquered. And I think right now we don't talk about how much the reason that there's such a suicidal, and I believe this, a suicidal ideology for so many people, live fast, die young, is such a contemporaneism. We're doing that because society is competing against itself for unrealistic expectations so that we can be better workers in a society that's collapsing. Of course there's suicidal people. The problem is indicative of the world, not of the person themselves. So I think we owe people the opportunity to show them a world that isn't complete suffering, and then let them make the decision if they really don't want to exist. Of course, that's because they already didn't. So fine. If you don't want to be part of this, I think that at that point is fine. You don't have to force someone to live who refuses. But the idea that we shouldn't bring people back just because of the fear that they might not want to live, I think that's kind of over the top.
Yes, I concur with you. And Jason Geringer makes good points as well. He writes, what if someone who died doesn't want to come back because they had a bad life?
Exactly.
What if when they come back to a really good life, and hopefully in the technologically advanced future, everybody would have access to a really good life? He writes, how would they know they won't come back to a great life? Indeed, in jurisdictions which have legalized assisted suicide, which I think has many problematic aspects, the arguments of the proponents have been essentially, well, what if a person is suffering horribly? What if a person is terminally ill? What if
Right.
there's no cure? But what if there is a cure? What if in the future we arrive at a state where these diseases that cause so much suffering today are easily reversed, the way we can easily cure certain infectious diseases? Like if you get the bubonic plague today, that's not a death sentence. That's easily treatable with modern medical care. Antibiotics can often take care of it. So what if for the future all cancers can be addressed very simply? You send in some nanobots to selectively kill the cancer cells and you're done. So in that case, people who are suffering from terminal cancer in horrible ways today may not need to suffer. And I do think anybody who desires death to any extent does so as a reaction to suffering some severe perceived suboptimality. What if we can correct that? And I think a lot of transhumanist thinkers aspire toward that world.
I think religious people do too. That's what's so interesting to me. Again, with the Chardin connection, if we're thinking about a world without suffering that you can be immortal in, you kind of just that's a rewrite. That's a rerun of Heaven. That's like the Heaven reboot. That's Son of Heaven. That's the movie, and there's nothing wrong with that. Creating a heavenscape could be great, but that's also a world where people could get bored. Janani and I have talked about this, and I think that you could avoid getting bored for a pretty long time. You might not realize how much potential there is, but let's imagine that after 20 billion years of jet skiing through the stars or something, and doing everything that there is to do, and having this 20 billion year vacation of paradisical quality, that you no longer want to be a person anymore. I think that's the difference between the concept of heaven and the concept of nirvana, because nirvana is this sort of where things stop moving, where there's no longer any movement because there's no longer a reason to aspire for anything. The moment you want something, you're no longer in nirvana, right? So there's a point maybe where you actually do, it's possible, complete the experience. You transcend the human experience, because the transhumanist experience could be to live in a paradise and to achieve all of your dreams for as long as possible. But it might be at a certain point, you yourself want to become the breath in all living things in another world, right? That's completely reasonable, just so you can be inside of all of your grandkids and all of the, like Vishnu as all of these pigs running through a field. Maybe that's your dream. I think it's completely reasonable that we reach a point where we're no longer interested in being the way we were, a singular being. That's, to me, though, the best example of something where you would no longer want to exist as a person, because we're talking about a situation where you can achieve anything you want to achieve. You don't have to suffer any sort of emotional. I mean, we're not talking about just curing cancer, curing depression. If people are upset because they miss their loved ones and they're physically in pain, those are all problems that go away. So the real answer is, how long can you go on in the human condition before you want to create some new phenomenological diversity or new worlds yourself and be maybe the energy that's in that world? I think that's basically the transcending principle of, from a being that's mortal to an immortal super being that is still a human, the transhuman, into being the ether itself of something. And those are not new concepts. That's what I find interesting about all this. These are all plans that people are making in terms of reality, that we're going to build technology that lead towards. But these are the same ideas that people sat out in the desert and talked about thousands of years ago. And we're just now getting to the point where we can start to achieve the first steps towards any of these goals. So it's all of a sudden worth to me considering some of these religious concepts, because if these are the dreams of humanity, we're going to accomplish them. That's what humans seem to be doing very quickly, right?
Yes, as many transhumanists have pointed out, it is within human nature to try to transcend the limits of human nature, and some of the attributes or outcomes that previously, according to various mythologies, and I would include religions among those, would have been considered godlike, could potentially be achieved through human scientific and technological advancement. I wanted to bring Daniel Tweed into this conversation because he asked, well, do we have any sort of rights framework that could be attributable to entities that do not exist? And I think the question would pertain to whether those entities existed at some point in the past. So I'm hesitant about granting rights to future generations, to the unborn, like people who say, oh, we need to, for instance, impose certain regulations on the climate now because that would lead to better outcomes, or it would preserve the environment for people who will be born 150 years from now. But we don't know who those people are in particular. We don't know what they're going to want. I similarly have problems with some of the arguments of the so-called long-termists that may try to justify short-term sacrifices if they make the point, well, this will make the world better or existence better for billions or trillions of people many thousands of years from now. I do think people who exist in the present do have a priority claim, but I think people in exercising their rights in the present should be able to set forth advanced directives for how they might want to be treated if they enter a state of legal death. And the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0 actually has a provision about this in Article 10 on morphological freedom. And morphological freedom is the right to do with one's physical attributes or intelligence whatever one wants, so long as it does not harm others. The article continues by stating this right includes the prerogative for a sentient intelligence to set forth in advance provisions for how to handle its physical manifestation, should that intelligence enter into a vegetative, unconscious, or similarly inactive state, notwithstanding any legal definition of death. For instance, a cryonics patient has the right to determine in advance that the patient's body shall be cryopreserved and kept under specified conditions in spite of any legal definition of death that might apply to that patient under cryopreservation. So I think we should want to have some sort of legal protections for cryonics patients who have deanimated, because right now, under the legal definition of death, these people have no rights, but we should want them to have some sorts of rights to continue being preserved in that cryo-suspended state, because otherwise somebody could just turn off the doer, turn off the power to the cryonics facility, and then every provision that that person has set forth prior to becoming legally deceased would be a nullity, essentially. So those may not be the same rights that we recognize for people who are currently alive, but what if, hypothetically, that person who becomes legally dead has an AI avatar? And that person has a contractual provision, and let's say those AI avatars are better, more lifelike, more versatile than AI avatars are today. But the contract would say, okay, in the event of my legal death, I delegate certain decision-making authority to my AI avatar, and that could include, say, managing my bank account, managing my investments for me, interacting with people. The AI avatar would be based on a synthesis of my writings and video appearances and anything else I put into it. And that AI avatar could serve as my legal representative. That AI avatar could at least make a decent attempt at saying, well, how would I respond to these future events that occur in the world? And then that AI avatar would also make provisions for my reanimation when the technology is sufficiently advanced. So, Daniel, since you brought up the question of rights for the non-existent, how would you view that kind of future situation where there could be a set of rights conferred on people who have been alive in the past, in the sense of how they would want their property or even manifestations of their person to be carried on, especially if there's a chance of a subsequent revival?
Yeah, this is we're beyond the limits of scientific testability. We're kind of into the realm of, platonic solids and things that feel true and just, but that's cool. I mean, science is just a concurring sequence of greater and greater probabilities, of testabilities. There's no absolute proof in science, so it's probably appropriate that we're in, philosophy, but I'm still willing to use science on these big cosmological, theological questions, and I think we all should be. In fact, this is probably a good use for synthetic, machine learning systems that we have out there. But I was, yeah, I think we want to maximize trueness and justice, truth and justice. It seems to be an inherent quality of consciousness, to be curious and to want things to fit, to want, things to seem, like they work out, which you could say that's justice, but maybe there's a reset point where the rights of the existent and the rights of the non-existent, reach a tipping point, and that's where the whole thing resets. Like Terence McKenna said, about the Big Bang, just give us one free miracle and we can explain everything else. It's like that one free miracle exception. But I'm wondering, do we have a plank in the USTP platform about the rights of the non-existent? Is there any plans to draft something up like that? Or I mean, this is maybe tangential to the
I think it's really important, and it's interesting because so many of the problems that we face right now, I mean, I hate to say it, but like abortion, I think this was one of those ones as well, like the rights of the non-existent. Stalin was an atheist and not a very spiritual man as far as I know, but he did make abortion illegal because he thought, well, the body of the woman is the property of the state, and they're producing units of labor, and so we got to protect these potential taxpayers. And it's interesting that this is something that could be looked at not even from some sort of a spiritual idea, but just from, hey, these are potential taxpayers that can exist. And the solutions to these things seem to be complicated because they have to impose upon our own individual liberties in order to extend those liberties to other people that we already exist with in this world, let alone people that could exist or might exist or did exist but might come back. I mean, these things become they're harder to stress to somebody that their rights need, an individual living person's rights need to be limited in order to protect the greater rights of the greater number of potential beings that could ever exist. Obviously, technology plays into this. I think a big thing with abortion will probably be the fetal chambers that they're developing, synthetic embryo and fetal chambers that they're designing so they can have gestation, synthetic gestation. Because if it's all of a sudden about, well, this is my property, get off my porch, well, then there's a solution to that if we build the technology for it. Then the next question is, what about genetic data property rights? I mean, this baby has half of my intellectual property, my genome. Maybe I don't want to give that to some other person. Those are the kinds of questions I think will really be more and more pressing in the next 10 years about abortion that we've never even thought about before. These are not the kinds of questions that have been asked about those issues, but they're going to become more important as we can tackle the first problems that we're experiencing. And the same thing with death, right? If we start seeing that people could be brought back from the dead, then of course we're going to have to protect their property, their finances, to understand if someone doesn't want to put it into a will, do we leave it into some sort of a Saxon trust? You know, like in the days of the Crusades where someone went off to war, they would leave their orchards with somebody until they returned from the crusade. And that could be something that happens, is that you have a trust to some extent. Are there going to be AI avatars that can be ambassadorially in charge? A couple of years ago, Gianni and I talked about this idea. Would there be an AI politician? And I thought, well, yeah, but it probably won't start with the president, right? It'd probably be like a team around a representative of a small, like maybe in Iowa or something like that, or in Eastern Europe. There might be like a single government advisor that has a cabinet around them. And this just happened. Romania, I think you heard, has this first AI. I just went to Romania, by the way. Albania has one now too. They're trying to push for the first Albanian AI politician. And I mean, I can't imagine it being any more error prone or corrupt than your average Albanian. I'm not saying, I'm just saying, I'm just being honest. Like there's a reason why this is happening. AI can make decisions, at least if they make mistakes, so do humans. And it's going to be more and more common that we see AI as something that's allowed to make certain decisions. But it will require governments to decide to protect those rights, to protect someone's right to have an AI character that represents them. But yeah, I can't speak for whether or not there are policies that are being thought up about this yet.
And I on a sort of related topic, I know Zoltan Istvan said he recently went to a party with a lot of, high flying celebrity and rich billionaire types. And they were absolutely horrified about the technological singularity was the consensus, and they wanted to derail it. They said it was a bigger problem than, World War III with nukes. I mean,
a little late, Zoltan. I like Zoltan, but
yes.
He was not sharing their
right.
view.
Yeah.
Right. This is where I think transhumanists urgently need to enter into the conversation, and why I like the largely very optimistic view of the singularity that you articulated, Andreas, because the prevailing cultural discourse is really tinged with fear. And this fear could lead to very reactionary types of responses that would limit technological progress and limit the freedom of individuals to deploy these technologies for their own benefit. By the way, the AI system in Albania that you mentioned is called Diela, and her official title is Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence of Albania, but she provides some input into the financial system and the fiscal decision making of the government in order to counteract corruption, which is interesting. Human politicians are often corrupt, but AI politicians may not have those kinds of motives. And I would say, I've said before in the 2024 US presidential election that I would have even preferred ChatGPT for president, even though ChatGPT was not sentient, not possessing of any inner experience.
People are like, oh, but AI lies. You're like, for a politician, that's par for the course. I don't know.
Right. At least AI doesn't lie intentionally in the way that human politicians do. Sure, it might hallucinate, but that could be checked by other humans and even other AI systems. A consortium of different AI models might check the hallucinations of any particular AI model. But in any event, Andreas, we have unfortunately reached the time limit for our virtual Enlightenment Salon, but this has been such a fascinating conversation, and we have gone from exploring various visions of the technological singularity, including the one that you articulated. We went on a bit of a tour of intellectual history with both secular and religious thinkers, and we even ventured into some possibilities like technological revival in the future, or parallel universes, or time travel. And I think each of these could have its own salon at some point in the future. But in the meantime, we thank you for joining us today. We thank our viewers in the chat for the lively exchange as always. And let's live to experience these possible futures for which we all need to live long and prosper.